Imagine a voice inside your head. Not a sound, but a pressure. A voice that tells you, "We were here before your species learned fire." In 1979, Vincent Harlow stared into the depthless black eyes of a creature locked 800 feet underground. He thought it was dying. He was wrong. It was waiting. This is the story of the harvest that never stopped, the story of why the cattle are mutilated, why the lights appear over the mesa, and why humanity was never the dominant species on this planet. Prepare yourself. Some truths cannot be unlearned. The orders came through on a Thursday, hand-delivered by a colonel whose name tag had been removed. Senior Airman Vincent Harlow signed for the manila envelope in the security office at Kirtland Air Force Base, watched the colonel leave without a word, and opened the packet to find a single sheet of paper. Temporary duty assignment, Dulce, New Mexico. Duration, 72 hours. Security escort for civilian medical personnel. Clearance level, TS/SCI with UMBRA, compartmentalization. Harlow had been Air Force Security Forces for 6 years, had guarded nuclear weapons at 3 different installations, had a spotless record, and a secret clearance that let him walk into rooms that didn't exist on base maps. He'd never heard of Umbra. He'd never heard of Dulce Base. The drive took 4 hours through high desert that looked like every other stretch of New Mexico emptiness until it didn't. The turnoff wasn't marked. The road wasn't paved. 20 miles of washboard dirt led to a chain-link fence that appeared in the middle of nowhere, topped with razor wire that gleamed too new for the rust-streaked posts holding it up. The guard shack looked abandoned. The guards inside looked like they wished they were. Harlow showed his orders. They made a phone call. 10 minutes later, a gate he hadn't seen rolled open in a section of fence that had looked solid. Dulce Base didn't look like a base. It looked like a geological survey station that had failed its cover story, a cluster of prefab buildings around a concrete bunker that descended into basalt like a mine shaft. The real facility was underground. Harlow knew this because he'd been briefed by a man in civilian clothes who never gave his name, just pointed to a schematic that showed 5 levels descending 800 feet into the mesa. Levels 1 and 2 were administrative. Level 3 was research. Level 4 was storage. Level 5 wasn't labeled. The civilian stood there in the August heat, sweat staining his shirt, and told Harlow that he was authorized to access levels 1 through 3. Level 4 required additional clearance he didn't have. Level 5 required clearance nobody had, unless the people who ran this place decided you needed it. The medical team arrived at 1900 hours in an unmarked van. 3 people, 2 men, 1 woman, no introductions. They wore surgical scrubs under lab coats, carried equipment cases that looked too heavy for medical supplies, and didn't make eye contact with anyone. The woman had dried blood on her shoes. Harlow noticed because he'd been trained to notice everything, and because the blood was brown, old, not from today. She saw him looking and turned away. The lead physician, gray-haired and hollow-eyed, handed Harlow a laminated card with a barcode and a reference number. "You're cleared for escort," he said. "You don't ask questions. You don't touch anything. You keep your weapon holstered unless I tell you otherwise." The elevator descended for 90 seconds, Harlow counted. At level 3, the doors opened onto a corridor that smelled like formaldehyde and ozone and something underneath that he couldn't identify, something organic and wrong. Fluorescent lights ran the length of the hallway, half of them flickering. The walls were concrete, bare, marked with stenciled numbers and biohazard symbols. They passed laboratories behind reinforced glass. Most were empty. One contained a table with restraints. Another held equipment Harlow recognized from his combat lifesaver training and equipment. He didn't. Machines with cables running into the floor. Level 4 required a retinal scan. The security checkpoint was manned by 2 guards in full MMOPP gear, chemical protection suits with respirators that made them look like insects. They didn't speak. One scanned Harlow's eyes with a device that made his vision purple for 30 seconds. The other drew blood from his arm with a syringe, fed it into a machine that beeped twice, and nodded. The door unlocked with a pneumatic hiss. The air pressure changed. Harlow's ears popped. The corridor beyond was colder, the lighting different, LEDs instead of fluorescents. The walls here were tile, white, the kind you could hose down. They walked past doors labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to him. The lead physician stopped at D4-7, pressed his palm to a reader, and waited. Somewhere behind the wall, machinery engaged. The door opened. The room was 30 feet square. Medical equipment lined 3 walls, monitoring stations, IV stands, a surgical table in the center under lights that weren't turned on. The thing on the table was covered with a sheet, but the sheet didn't hide the shape underneath. Too tall, arms too long. The skull elongated in a way that made Harlow think of birth defects, except this wasn't a birth defect. This was something else. The lead physician pulled back the sheet. Harlow's training kept him from stepping back. His instincts screamed at him to run. The biological asset measured 7 feet from crown to feet. Gray skin with a texture like dolphin hide, smooth and slightly translucent. No body hair, no visible sex organs. The torso was emaciated, ribs showing through skin that looked dehydrated, collapsing inward. 4 fingers on each hand, no thumb, the digits too long, and ending in what might have been suction cups, or might have been something worse. The face was what stopped Harlow's breath, almost human. High cheekbones, a nose that was just 2 slits, eyes that were closed but too large under the lids, bulging slightly. A mouth that was too wide and too thin. The skin around the neck showed bruising, restraint marks. This thing had been awake. This thing had fought. The physician moved to the monitoring equipment, began attaching sensors to the asset's chest. 72 hours ago, this specimen was responsive, he said, not looking at Harlow. Vital signs consistent with a metabolic rate approximately 40% higher than human baseline. No digestive system, no waste elimination. Respiratory system present but non-functional in standard atmosphere. It doesn't breathe like we do. It absorbs something from the air we can't measure. He pressed a stethoscope to the thing's chest. No heartbeat. Hasn't had one since we recovered it. The circulatory system operates on a different principle. Osmotic pressure. Fluid movement without muscular contraction. The woman physician opened one of the equipment cases. Inside were syringes, scalpels, and a device that looked like a biopsy needle, except it glowed faintly blue. She pulled on latex gloves, selected a syringe, and approached the table. Tissue samples show human mitochondrial DNA, she said. Markers consistent with Southwest Native American populations. But the chromosomes are wrong. 24 pairs instead of 23. The extra pair codes for proteins that don't exist in any terrestrial organism. She inserted the needle into the asset's forearm. The skin resisted, then gave. The syringe filled with fluid that wasn't quite blood, something darker, viscous. That's when Harlow saw the eyes open, not blinking. Just suddenly open, like a switch had flipped. Black, completely black. No whites, no iris, just depthless black that reflected the overhead lights in a way that made them look like they went back forever, like looking into a well with no bottom. The asset didn't move, didn't breathe, but the eyes tracked, first to the woman with the syringe, then to the lead physician, then to Harlow. And Harlow understood with absolute certainty that this thing was conscious, aware, intelligent, and that it knew exactly what was happening to it. The monitoring equipment began to alarm. Heart rate spiking, except there was no heart. Brain activity surging, except the EEG leads weren't properly attached. The lead physician shouted something. The woman dropped the syringe. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, red and insufficient. In the crimson dimness, Harlow saw the asset sit up. No struggle, no effort, just a fluid motion that shouldn't have been possible for something that deteriorated, something that was supposed to be dying. The restraints were still buckled. They hadn't been opened. The asset was simply no longer in them, standing beside the table. 7 feet of impossible biology that moved like smoke. Harlow's hand went to his sidearm. The lead physician screamed, "Don't!" But Harlow had already drawn, already aimed, already seen that the thing wasn't attacking, wasn't advancing, was just standing there with those black eyes fixed on him. And then it spoke. Not words, not sound. Something that happened inside Harlow's head, a pressure, a knowing, a voice that wasn't a voice saying things he couldn't translate but understood anyway. You know what we are. You've always known. Your governments have always known. This is not first contact. This is continuation. We were here before your species learned fire. We will be here after your species forgets it. And what you do to us, we remember. The lights came back on. The asset was on the table again, motionless, eyes closed. The restraints were buckled. The monitoring equipment showed flatline. The lead physician was on his knees, vomiting. The woman was pressed against the wall, sobbing. Harlow's service weapon was still aimed at nothing. His camera, mounted on his vest per protocol, had recorded everything. 14 minutes of footage. 14 minutes that would be classified TS/S CIUMBRA within the hour. 14 minutes that would end his career, his clearance, his ability to ever speak about what he'd seen. But he'd seen it. And in the decades that followed, in the nights when sleep wouldn't come, he'd remember those eyes and wonder how many levels below 5 this place really went. The debriefing started 6 hours after the lights came back on. They moved Harlow to level 2, to a windowless room with a metal table and chairs bolted to the floor. 2 men in suits, no names, no agency identification. One set up a tape recorder. The other placed Harlow's vest camera on the table between them, the red recording light still blinking. "You're going to tell us everything you saw," the first man said. "Then you're going to sign a document stating you saw nothing. Then you're going to forget Dulce Base exists," Harlow told them. The thing sitting up. The restraints that weren't restraints. The voice that wasn't a voice. He watched their faces and saw no surprise, just the flat expression of men who'd heard this before from other witnesses, in other briefings. When he finished, the second man ejected the camera's data card, placed it in a metal case, and locked it. "This recording never happened," he said. "You were never on level 5. You escorted medical personnel to level 3 for a routine equipment inspection. They had him sign papers, non-disclosure agreements, security violation acknowledgments, documents acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure would result in federal prosecution under the Espionage Act. His security clearance was suspended pending review. He was confined to quarters for 72 hours. No phone calls, no communication with anyone outside the facility. In the small room they gave him, Harlow lay on a cot and stared at the ceiling and tried to process what he'd experienced. The asset's words kept replaying. Not first contact, continuation. "We were here before your species learned fire. If that was true, if any of it was true, then everything was different. History was different. Humanity's place in the universe was different. And the government had known. For how long?" On the second night of his confinement, the alarm started. Not the base's general alarm, something else, a pulsing klaxon that made his teeth hurt. The lights in his room went red. His door unlocked automatically, emergency protocol. Harlow stepped into the corridor and found chaos. Personnel running, someone shouting orders over the PA system about containment breach level 5, all security personnel to rally points. He wasn't armed. His sidearm had been confiscated during debriefing. But he was still Air Force Security Forces, and training overrode confusion. He followed the running personnel to the elevator bay, found 30 people trying to evacuate up a shaft that only held 12 at a time. The panic in their eyes told him everything. Whatever had breached containment, they were more afraid of it than of looking like cowards. A captain grabbed his arm, young, sweating, pupils dilated. "You were on escort duty, level 5. You've seen them." Not a question. Harlow nodded. The captain thrust a M16A2 into his hands, 2 magazines taped together. Then you know what we're dealing with. D4-7 is open. The asset isn't in the room. We've got 3 personnel unaccounted for and something moving in the ventilation system. The rifle felt good in Harlow's hands, familiar, real. Something he could understand in a facility that made no sense. Orders? The captain's radio crackled with static and something underneath that might have been screaming. Locate and neutralize, he said. Non-lethal if possible. But if it's a choice between containment and survival, you survive. They went down in a 4-man team. Harlow, the captain, and 2 enlisted men who looked barely old enough to enlist. The elevator descended past level 3, past level 4. At level 5, the doors opened onto darkness. The emergency lighting was out. The captain produced flashlights, military-grade LED beams that cut the black like knives. The corridor looked different in the dark. The white tile walls seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. The air tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. They moved in tactical formation, weapons raised, flashlights sweeping. The first door they passed was open. D4-3. Inside, an empty containment cell with walls that looked scorched, black marks radiating from a central point like an explosion, except there was no structural damage, just the burning. D4-5 was worse. The door had been opened from the inside, the locking mechanism torn apart, metal peeled back like foil. The room beyond contained examination equipment and something else, something organic on the walls. Not blood, something clear and viscous that caught the flashlight beams and seemed to move, flowing slowly downward. One of the enlisted men touched it. His glove came away smoking. Chemical burn. He bit back a scream. The captain pulled him back, examined the glove. The material was dissolving, eaten through in seconds. "Don't touch anything," he said. Unnecessary advice. They all understood now. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a hunt, and they might not be the hunters. They found the first body at the intersection of 2 corridors. Dr. Sarah Chen, the woman from the medical team, still in her lab coat. She was face down, arms outstretched like she'd been running. No visible wounds. The captain turned her over carefully. Her eyes were open, black, completely black, no whites showing. Her mouth was open too, frozen in an expression that wasn't fear and wasn't pain. Something else, something worse. Recognition, understanding. The captain checked for a pulse. Nothing. Body temperature already dropping. "How long?" Harlow asked. The captain didn't answer, just stood up and keyed his radio. Static. No response from the surface. They were on their own. The ventilation grate 20 feet away began to vibrate. A sound came from inside the ductwork, not mechanical, organic. Breathing that was too slow, too deep, like something much larger than the space it occupied. The 4 of them aimed weapons at the grate. The sound stopped. Silence so complete, Harlow could hear his own heartbeat, rapid, too rapid. Then, movement, fast, something pale and elongated dropping from the grate and disappearing into a side corridor before anyone could fire. "Contact!" the captain shouted, unnecessary. They all saw it. They all knew what it was. The pursuit took them deeper into level 5, past rooms Harlow hadn't seen during the escort duty, laboratories with equipment he couldn't identify, chambers filled with tanks containing fluid and shapes floating inside that might have been specimens or might have been something else. In one room, a wall covered with photographs, aerial shots of desert terrain marked with coordinates, close-ups of excavation sites, and faces, dozens of faces, humans with those same black eyes, people of every age and ethnicity staring at the camera with expressions that showed no emotion, no humanity. The captain paused at this room, his flashlight lingering on the photographs. "They've been doing this for decades," he said quietly. "This isn't containment. This is harvest." The asset was waiting for them in D4-12, not hiding, just standing in the center of the room under dead lights, 7 feet of impossible anatomy, gray skin slick with that clear fluid, black eyes reflecting their flashlights. But this wasn't the deteriorating specimen Harlow had seen on the table. This was something healthy, vital, alive in a way that made his hindbrain scream warnings. It didn't move as they entered, weapons raised. It just watched, and when it spoke, all four of them heard it, not in their ears but in their minds. That same pressure, that same knowing voice. You cannot kill what was never born. You cannot contain what has no form. Your weapons are irrelevant. Your protocols are theater. We allow you to study us because it amuses us to watch you try to understand. But you never will. Your neurology is insufficient. Your consciousness is limited. You are children playing with forces you call paranormal because you lack the framework to recognize them as natural. One of the enlisted men fired. 3-round burst, center mass, perfect grouping. The rounds hit the asset and kept going, passing through it like it was smoke, impacting the concrete wall behind and ricocheting. The asset didn't flinch. It reached out with one 4-fingered hand, moved toward the shooter with that fluid motion that covered 10 feet in a heartbeat. Harlow watched the enlisted man's rifle fall from nerveless fingers, watched him stand there as the asset placed its hand on his forehead, watched his eyes go black, all color draining away, replaced by that depthless void. The man smiled. Not a human smile, something that used human muscles wrong, pulled them in directions they weren't meant to go. "We've been here so long," the man said with a voice that wasn't his voice. "Your government knows, has always known. The treaties were signed before you were born. We take some of you. You get technology you don't understand. Everyone pretends this is voluntary." The captain shot the enlisted man. Single round, head shot, no hesitation. The body dropped. The asset withdrew its hand and turned those black eyes on the captain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the captain's nose began to bleed, dark blood running down his face. He dropped his weapon, clutched his head. "Get out," he managed to say. "Harlow, get topside. Tell them containment is compromised. Tell them we need sterilization protocol." Harlow understood what that meant. Sterilization, thermite charges, collapse the entire facility, bury everything under 1,000 tons of rock and pretend it never existed. He ran. Behind him he heard gunfire, screaming, the captain's voice cutting off mid-word. The remaining enlisted man caught up to him at the elevator, wild-eyed and sobbing. They went up together, past level 4, past 3. At level 2, the doors opened onto more chaos. The breach wasn't contained to level 5 anymore. Personnel were evacuating, grabbing documents, destroying computers. A fire had started somewhere, smoke filling the corridors. The base commander, a Colonel Harlow had never met, was shouting into a radio about authorization codes, about fail-safes, about needing confirmation from someone higher up the chain. How high did you have to go to get authorization to destroy a base that didn't officially exist? They made it to the surface at 0347 hours. Dawn was still hours away. The New Mexico desert stretched empty and dark under stars that suddenly seemed very far away and very indifferent. Personnel were loading trucks, burning papers in barrels, evacuating with the practiced efficiency of people who'd drilled for this. Harlow found the civilian who'd briefed him 3 days ago, grabbed him by the collar. "What the hell is down there?" The man's eyes were hollow. "Something we've been studying since 1947, he said. "Something that's been studying us much longer. And something your camera recorded that you weren't supposed to see." He pulled free. "You're being transferred. Effective immediately. Different service, different name. You'll never speak about this. If you try, you'll have an accident." The explosion came at dawn. Harlow watched from 5 miles away as the mesa that contained Dulce Base collapsed inward, a controlled demolition disguised as a geological event. The official story would call it a sinkhole. The unofficial story would circulate among conspiracy researchers for decades. And Harlow, reassigned to logistics in Germany under a name that wasn't his, would lie awake some nights and remember those black eyes, and wonder how many other bases had level 5s, and what happened when the treaties broke down. Vincent Harlow became Thomas Reed in the fall of 1979. New service record, new assignment, new history that erased 6 years of security clearances and classified postings. The Air Force sent him to Ramstein, Germany, stuck him behind a desk processing supply requisitions for aircraft parts. Safe. Boring. Exactly the kind of assignment you gave someone you wanted to forget about. He spent 3 years there, never talking about Dulce, never mentioning New Mexico, watching his file grow thinner as his old life was systematically erased. When he mustered out in 1982, his DD-214 showed service so unremarkable it was invisible. No commendations, no deployments, just a mediocre airman who'd put in his time and left. The Veterans Affairs Office processed his discharge without comment. He might as well have never existed. He tried civilian life, security work mostly, casino surveillance in Reno, corporate protection in Denver, jobs where he could use his training without explaining where he got it. But the dreams wouldn't stop. Every few nights he'd wake up seeing those black eyes, hearing that voice that wasn't a voice telling him truths he couldn't unlearn. We were here before your species learned fire. Your governments have always known. The treaties were signed before you were born. He started drinking to sleep, then drinking to stay awake, then just drinking. By 1985, he was living in a studio apartment in Albuquerque, unemployed, surviving on disability payments for PTSD the VA didn't understand and couldn't treat. The letter arrived in January 1987. No return address. Plain envelope with his real name, Vincent Harlow, typed on the front. Inside, a single newspaper clipping from the Dulce Independent, a weekly paper serving a town of 3,000 people. The headline read, "Local rancher reports missing cattle, unusual markings." The article described classic mutilation patterns, precise surgical cuts, organs removed with medical precision, no blood at the scene, no tracks. The rancher, a man named Jim Valdez, claimed to have seen lights over the mesa the night before he found the cattle. The article treated it as a curiosity, local color for a slow news week. But Harlow recognized the location from the coordinates in the article, 3 miles from where Dulce Base used to be, where the official story said a sinkhole had swallowed a geological survey station in 1979. He drove up 2 days later. The town of Dulce sat on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, a scatter of buildings along Highway 64 that existed primarily to serve the reservation and a handful of ranchers. Nobody looked at him twice. He found Jim Valdez at a feed store, a weathered man in his 60s who didn't want to talk about the cattle until Harlow bought him lunch and 3 beers. Then he talked. Not just about the recent mutilations, about things going back decades. Lights in the sky, helicopters with no markings, trucks coming and going on roads that didn't lead anywhere, people in town who'd worked at the facility before it closed, who wouldn't say what they did there, who died young from cancers and illnesses that didn't make sense. "My cousin worked there," Valdez said, staring into his beer. "Security, like you maybe. He came back different in 79. Wouldn't talk about what happened. Started drinking. Told me once when he was real drunk that they'd had a breach, that something got loose, that the whole place was contaminated and they'd sealed it up with people still inside." He looked up at Harlow. "He died in 82. Suicide, they said. But I saw the body. He had marks on him. Burns that looked like handprints, but the fingers were too long, too many joints." Harlow felt his blood go cold. "Did he ever mention the assets?" Valdez's eyes narrowed. You were there." They drove out to the mesa that night. Valdez knew the back roads, the access routes that didn't show on maps. The collapse site was cordoned off with Forest Service barriers that looked official but weren't, warning signs about unstable ground and dangerous conditions. Valdez drove past them. The sinkhole was massive, maybe 200 feet across, a crater that dropped into darkness. At the bottom, Harlow could see concrete twisted rebar, the remains of structures that had been underground. The government hadn't filled it in. They just fenced it off and let time do the work of making people forget. Valdez parked on the rim, killed the engine. "They still come here," he said. "Couple times a year. Black helicopters. They land, go down there, come back up. Taking samples, maybe. Making sure it stays dead. He pulled out a flask, took a drink, offered it to Harlow. But it's not dead. The mutilation started again in '85. 3-4 cattle a month. Same patterns, same precision. Whatever was down there, it didn't die in the collapse. Harlow thought about the asset in D4-12, the way it had moved through walls, the way bullets passed through it. You cannot kill what was never born. They're still here, he said. They never left. That's when the lights appeared, not overhead, down in the sinkhole, a blue glow emanating from the depths, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Valdez grabbed Harlow's arm. We need to go, now. But Harlow was already out of the truck, walking toward the edge, drawn by something he couldn't name. The glow grew brighter. Shapes moved in it, tall and thin and wrong. And that voice, that terrible voice he'd heard 8 years ago in a room on level 5, speaking directly into his mind. You came back. We knew you would. You all come back. The ones who see us, who touch the truth, you cannot forget. Your species has such limited memory, but trauma etches deep. You remember us in your nightmares. You see us in your peripheral vision, and slowly, over years, you come to understand. This planet was never yours alone. Harlow wanted to run. His body screamed at him to move, to get away, but he stood frozen at the crater's edge, watching shapes rise from the ruins below, not climbing, floating, ascending without effort, their elongated forms silhouetted against the blue light. There were dozens of them, and as they rose, the light spread, illuminating more of the crater. And Harlow saw that the base hadn't been destroyed at all. The surface levels had collapsed, yes, but the deep levels, levels 6 and 7 and 8 and however many more, existed that he'd never seen. Those were intact, and they were active. The harvest never stopped, the voice said. Your government brings us subjects, volunteers, they tell you, abductees, in truth, people who won't be missed, the homeless, the addicted, the undocumented. We study them, we improve them, we return some of them. The ones we return, they have black eyes for a while. Then the color comes back, and they remember nothing. But we remember everything, every genetic sequence, every neural pathway, every weakness in your biology. When the time comes, when the treaty ends, we will be ready. Valdez was screaming at him from the truck. The shapes were close now, maybe 30 feet below the crater's rim, rising steadily. Harlow could see details. The gray skin, the 4-fingered hands, the faces that were almost human but fundamentally wrong. And he understood with horrible clarity that this was happening everywhere. That Dulce was just one site. That the conspiracy researchers were right about everything except the scale. This wasn't a cover-up. This was collaboration. This was surrender. He ran, made it to the truck as the first of the assets crested the rim. Valdez floored it, tires spraying gravel, the vehicle fishtailing on the dirt road. Behind them, the blue light grew brighter, spreading across the mesa like dawn. Harlow looked back and saw them standing at the crater's edge, dozens of them, watching the truck flee. Not pursuing, not concerned, just watching with those black eyes that held no malice and no mercy, only the patient observation of a superior intelligence studying an inferior one. They made it back to Dulce as the sun rose. Valdez dropped him at his rental car, hands shaking on the wheel. "What do we do?" he asked. Harlow had no answer. Who could they tell? The government knew, the military knew. The whole system was complicit, had been complicit since 1947 or earlier, since whenever the treaties had been signed. Going public meant being discredited, disappeared, or dead. "We survive," Harlow said finally. "We document, we tell the truth to people who listen, and we wait." He spent the next 30 years doing exactly that, collecting testimony from other witnesses, tracking mutilations and abductions, building a network of people who knew, who'd seen, who couldn't forget. The government called them conspiracy theorists. The media mocked them, but their numbers grew. By 2009, there were thousands of people who'd seen too much, who carried cameras now, who posted their evidence online where it couldn't be fully suppressed. The truth was leaking out, slowly, drop by drop. Harlow died in 2017, officially from heart failure, in a veterans' home in Arizona. His room was cleaned out by staff who threw away boxes of documents marked with coordinates and dates and names. But he'd uploaded copies to a dozen servers, encrypted and time-locked, set to release in 2025. This document you're reading now, this transcript of events, is part of that release. Vincent Harlow wanted you to know, wanted you to understand that what happened at Dulce in 1979 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a moment when the veil slipped, when the carefully maintained fiction cracked, when one airman saw too much and survived long enough to tell about it. The base is still there. The deep levels never closed. The assets are still being studied, or maybe we're the ones being studied. Maybe we always have been. And sometimes, late at night, in the desert places where the government presence is heaviest and the official explanations thinnest, you can see lights in the sky. Blue lights, moving with purpose. And if you're very unlucky, you might see what comes down from those lights. Tall shapes, gray skin, black eyes that have been watching humanity since before we built our first civilizations. We were never alone on this planet. We were never the dominant species. We just thought we were, because that's what they wanted us to think. The treaties are still in effect, the harvest continues, and the only question that matters now is, when the treaties end, what happens to the rest of us? Some truths you can't unlearn. Some doors, once opened, don't close. Vincent Harlow opened that door in March 1979. This is what he found on the other side. This is what they don't want you to know. This is why people who talk about Dulce end up dead, discredited, or disappeared. Because the truth isn't just dangerous, it's terminal. The assets are still there, 5 levels down, or 7 or 12, waiting, watching, remembering every face, every name, every person who stumbled into clearance levels they shouldn't have accessed. And if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, they're watching you too now. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. Knowledge is contamination. Truth is infection. And once you know, you can never go back to the comfortable lie that we're alone, that we're safe, that the governments of the world exist to protect us. Welcome to the real world. Vincent Harlow would tell you he's sorry, but he'd also tell you that you deserve to know, that we all deserve to know what's being done in our name, with our tax dollars, in facilities that don't exist on any map. The truth is out there. It's also down there, 5 levels beneath the New Mexico desert, waiting.